Poverty doesn't have to lead to negative mental health, but we do need to think seriously about intervening. And we know that poverty is the single best predictor of mental illness in adulthood, so that needs to be taken seriously. Poverty titrates stress into the parent-infant relationship. All these stresses will make the parent feel bad, negative about themselves, and of course that will impact the parenting, that will impact the baby's perception of how they're being held, how they're being contained, and can easily set up the negative spiral that those of you, health visitors in the audience? I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs here. They know all about this sort of stuff. I mean, health visitors are the jodrell, are the early warning system of the country's mental health. They're the most important profession you have. Be nice to them. Health visitors and midwives are really important. They should be paid much, much more than they are, and they should be taken seriously by everybody working in mental health. If we look at the first year attachment cycle, we can see immediately that it's vulnerable to the parent finding it hard to attune to the baby's internal states. And if the baby's internal states are those of distress, anxiety, fretfulness, which are only some of the baby's internal states, don't forget, because babies have all sorts of, they have the full spectrum of emotion, just the same as us. But if the parent feels stressed and overwhelmed and fretful, has a sense of low self-esteem, the child's cries may trigger all sorts of unawakened, unknown conflicts and anxieties within herself. So that appropriate sensitive responsiveness, where the parent has the capacity to respond appropriately to the child's signals, whether they're positive signals or negative signals, roughly 50% of the time, nobody gets it accurate, that's interfered with. And so this cycle, this benign cycle of attachment gets interfered with. And we know that poverty and stress are associated with neurological dysregulation in the mother, which in turn will affect directly her capacity to sensitively respond to the baby. So there'll be less appropriate responses. Babies need appropriate responses. The parent's task is to be like the external cortex for the child, because the child hasn't got the cortical capacity, hasn't got the executive functions to self-regulate, hasn't developed the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system to have an awareness of what they're feeling and to be able to have a feedback system to dampen or excite themselves when necessary. If maternal motivation and sensitivity is disrupted, that will impact the relationship, and again we see more of this in low-income households. So when this goes wrong, we get a negative attachment cycle. This is what we're trying to avoid. If we have an infant mental health team, this is the target. The target is the relationship to avoid this becoming set up, to avoid the child's increasing distress having a negative impact on the parent, or even worse, to avoid the child internalising the parent's defences, because parents and infants, if they're both dysregulated, get into an escalating cycle of pain and anxiety. The parent deals with it by repressing, switching it off, which is a sort of adult ego defence. We don't want the babies to repress, we don't want them to dissociate, because that means they're already making a split in their internal world. And you can see this quite easily with babies around about age 1, when babies have learned to suppress signs of anxiety, which they're actually showing physiologically. So by age 1, babies can completely make a split between what their body is experiencing and what their mind is allowing them to self-represent. So what we're trying to do is stop this negative cycle becoming set up. The early attachment relationship is hugely important. So when it goes wrong, this will have a knock-on effect. It will have a knock-on effect in terms of what Balbernie called these internal working models, these internal representations of attachments, which is basically the software of relationships, telling you what's going to happen next, telling you how people are going to respond to you in general, and giving you a sense of self in interaction. Otherwise, you'd have to work out every interaction anew, and that would be really difficult. So the software of relationships is programmed by these early responses between parent and child. That's what we call these internal working models. We learn relationship skills. We learn the ability to self-regulate. We learn empathy. Empathy may be innate with mirror neurons, but it has to be nurtured. And if you've never been shown empathy, how are you going to show it to somebody else when you get to be an adult? It's going to be really hard through no fault of your own. And also the important thing is emotional control, self-regulation, which is synonymous with attachment. People talk a lot of bosh about attachment, but basically when we look at attachment, it's the capacity that the child has to self-regulate in times of stress. Attachment is about closeness and distance, but the child uses the closeness to gain the capacity to self-regulate. When the child's got disordered attachments, it means they've been in a really stressed household. They've had parents who've been overwhelmed by their own troubles, so that they're either frightening or frightened. Very broad division, but it actually covers most things in terms of a parental state of mind. If a parental state of mind both activates the baby's attachment system, or the toddler's attachment system, and yet closeness to the parent does not deactivate the attachment system, the child is put in this push me, pull you sort of relationship, which means that the attachment system is never deactivated. So they're left in a permanent state of stress, a permanent state of high activation. And again, they never learn to self-regulate. And the whole point about a mutual regulation pattern between parent and child is the child learns to self-regulate, and that's the first step towards forming a separate identity and becoming a separate individual in early childhood.